We grew up in his worlds. Green eggs and ham, the cat in the hat, oh, the places you'll go. Bright colors, bouncing rhymes, a universe where even chaos feels safe because Dr. Seuss will always guide us back home by the last page. But tonight, we're not staying in the storybook. Tonight, we step behind the drawings and into a real life that never made it into the picture books. The life of a woman who helped create them and the darkness that ultimately consumed her. This is the story of Helen Palmer Geisel, and you're watching A Veil of Crime. Before we begin, a very important warning. This episode discusses depression, serious illness, marital infidelity, and death by suicide. I will not describe anything in a graphic way, but the emotional weight of this story is heavy. Please take care of yourself while you watch. If this feels too close to home, it's okay to step away. Now, let's pull back the veil. Picture Brooklyn at the turn of the 20th century. Brownstones, tree-lined streets, and a little girl named Helen Marion Palmer growing up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, back when it was a prosperous neighborhood. As a child, Helen was bright, curious, and bookish. She also got very sick. Biographers say that she contracted polio as a girl, recovering almost completely but never forgetting what it felt like to have her body betray her. Her father, an eye doctor, died when she was just 11. Loss and illness were not strangers to her. They arrived early, quietly shaping a girl who learned to endure. Helen threw herself into academics. She graduated from college with honors, a serious intellectual at a time when women were still being gently steered away from ambition. She taught English at a girls' high school, then moved with her mother to England so that she could study at Oxford. And at Oxford, in a classroom filled with lecture and Latin, she noticed a young American man whose notebooks were not filled with lecture notes. They were filled with animals, impossible animals. His name was Theodore Geisel. Friends called him Ted. The world would later call him Dr. Seuss. Helen watched him sketch during class. Odd, whimsical creatures that looked like they'd climbed straight out of a child's dream. One day she told him something that would shape the rest of his life. In essence, she said, "You shouldn't be an English professor. You should do that. You should draw." It's hard to overstate what that moment meant. Helen was older, accomplished, and sharp. She saw what Ted didn't yet fully see in himself, that his doodles weren't just distractions, they were a future. The two fell in love. In 1927, they married. She was 28 and he was 23. They returned to the United States and built a life together that, from the outside, looked like a creative fairy tale. Ted climbed in advertising and magazine cartoons. Helen worked as a writer and editor, helping them stay afloat during the lean years. When Dr. Seuss books began to take off, Helen wasn't just the supportive wife in the background. She was reading the drafts, steering projects, handling business, and whispering the kind of hard truths only someone who loves you will say. For decades, Helen was his first editor, his reality check, and his biggest champion. Some biographers describe her as his indispensable collaborator, the quiet axis on which the whole Seussian world turned. By the 1950s, Dr. Seuss was becoming a phenomenon. Then came a moment that would change children's publishing forever: The Cat in the Hat. Its success sparked a new idea, an entire line of simple, engaging early reader books that didn't talk down to kids. In 1958, Helen and Ted, along with their friend Phyllis Cerf, co-founded Beginner Books. Ted served as president. Helen became vice president, but she wasn't just signing checks. She wrote books of her own for imprint. Some of them include A Fish Out of Water, I Was Kissed by a Seal at the Zoo, Do You Know What I'm Going to Do Next Saturday, and Why I Built the Boogle House. In some of these, she blended stories with photographs of real children and animals. In others, she expanded a short Dr. Seuss tale into a full book, proving that she could carry the narrative on her own. But here's the thing, most of us don't know Helen's name. We know Dr. Seuss, we know the cat, we know the Grinch. The woman who co-created the Beginner Books line, who edited his manuscripts, who kept the business running, and who also wrote for children, is usually reduced to a footnote: his first wife. In life, she was anything but a footnote. Behind the scenes, Helen's health began to crumble. Accounts differ on the exact diagnosis, but biographers agree on this. For more than a decade, Helen lived with serious chronic illness. Some sources describe a syndrome that left her partially paralyzed, similar to Guillain-Barré. Others reference a battle with cancer layered on top of that. Whatever the labels, the reality was brutal. She endured pain, weakness, and medical procedures. Activities that used to be simple became exhausting. She could no longer move through the world with the ease she once had. Imagine being the central support beam of a creative empire, handling edits, business matters, household logistics, and then slowly losing your physical strength. Layer that over a personality that was already perfectionistic and self-critical, and you begin to see the trap closing in. When Helen was in her 60s, Ted was enjoying towering success. The Dr. Seuss brand was becoming a cultural juggernaut. Appearances, tours, deadlines, expectations. The pressure was constant. And Helen? She was tired, in pain, and scared. By then, the Geisels were living in La Jolla, California, an oceanfront community with postcard sunsets. Among their circle of friends was a woman named Audrey Stone Dimond. Audrey was younger, married, a nurse. She and her husband became friends with Helen and Ted. Over time, that friendship shifted. Audrey and Ted began an affair. According to later interviews and biographies, Audrey would sit by the window at the Geisels' home, staring out at the ocean, fully aware that what she and Ted were doing was dangerous, not just to reputations, but to the woman who had spent 40 years building a life with him. Helen wasn't naive. She suspected, and then she knew. For a woman whose identity was deeply entwined with her husband's work, the realization that he had emotionally left their marriage, even as they still technically shared a home, was shattering. Combine that emotional betrayal with chronic pain, serious illness, and the looming fear of becoming a burden, and you begin to understand the depth of her despair. In the months leading up to October 1967, Helen's world narrowed. Friends later remembered her exhaustion, and biographers describe a woman who felt trapped in a failing body and a collapsing marriage, watching the man she loved turn increasingly toward another woman. She wasn't just losing her husband, she was losing her role, her place, the sense that she mattered. At some point, Helen sat down to write a letter. It was her suicide note. Most of it has been quoted only in biographies, but the pieces that we know are devastating. She described a feeling like she was in a spiral going down into a black hole from which there was no escape. She wrote that all she could hear was the word failure coming from every side. She told Ted she loved him, and that she was too old and too enmeshed in everything you do and you are to imagine a life without you. And then, chillingly practical, she wrote that her death would leave quite a rumor, but that he could tell people that she had been overworked and overwrought, so his reputation would not be harmed. Even in her final words, Helen was protecting him, thinking about his image, trying to manage the story so that the beloved Dr. Seuss brand would remain intact. On October 23, 1967, in their home in La Jolla, California, Helen Palmer Geisel died by suicide. Reports say that she took an overdose of barbiturates, a common sedative medication of that era. She was 69 years old. The news did not become a tabloid scandal. There were no true crime podcasts, no documentary exposés. The story was quieted, softened, and often explained in vague phrases like after a long illness or due to ill health. The darker truth, that years of physical suffering and the emotional devastation of her husband's affair had crushed her, stayed largely in the shadows. Ted's reaction, at least in his own words, was chaotic. Biographers quote him saying that he didn't know whether to kill himself, burn the house down, or simply disappear. But the choices that he made after that moment are, well, complicated. 8 months after Helen's death, Ted Geisel married Audrey, the neighbor, the friend, the woman Helen had long suspected was at the center of her heartbreak. With that marriage, Ted stepped into a new life as a husband and stepfather to Audrey's 2 daughters. Audrey would go on to become the guardian of the Dr. Seuss estate, shaping how the world saw his work for decades. As for Helen, her story stayed mostly in the background. In obituaries, she remained his first wife. In fan conversations, she was rarely mentioned at all. When you pick up a beginner book today and see the iconic Cat in the Hat logo, there's nothing on the cover that tells you about the woman who helped build that imprint. No hint of the chronic pain, the loneliness, or the desperation behind the scenes. There is a detail of the story that I want to treat very carefully. People close to Ted later described Helen's death, her decision to remove herself from his life, as her last and greatest gift to him. That language is haunting. It frames her suicide as an act of love, as though her absence freed him from a difficult marriage so he could move forward, guilt-light, and into a happier life. I need to be absolutely clear. That framing is not romantic. It is tragic. Helen was not a problem to be solved. She was not a barrier to someone else's happiness. She was a person in deep psychological pain, pain made worse by illness, betrayal, and a culture that often told women their primary value was in how well they supported their husbands. The idea that her death was a gift says more about the people who survived her than it does about her reality. So what do we do with a story like this? Dr. Seuss is woven into childhoods around the world. His books are still beloved, even as we now grapple with the problematic stereotypes and images in some of his work. Learning about Helen doesn't require you to burn your books or renounce your favorite rhymes, but it does ask something of us. It asks us to remember that behind the branding, there are people. Behind the genius, there is often someone quietly keeping the machine running. Behind the legend, there may be a partner whose name that we never learn. Helen wasn't perfect. None of us are. But she was brilliant, ambitious, creative, and deeply committed to the man whose legacy eclipsed her own. She helped build a world that told children, you have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes, you can steer yourself any direction you choose. And yet, in the end, she felt that she had no direction left, no choices that included herself. That's the real tragedy. Before we close, I want to step out of the past for a moment and speak to the present. If any part of Helen's story resonates with you, feeling trapped, feeling like a burden, feeling like the world would be better off without you, please hear this. The story is lying to you. You are not a rumor to be managed. You are not just a supporting character in someone else's narrative. You matter on your own. If you're struggling with thoughts of self-harm, please reach out to someone you trust, a mental health professional, or a crisis hotline in your area. If you can, talk to a doctor, a counselor, or even a close friend. You deserve help and you deserve to stay. Helen didn't live in a time when mental health was openly discussed. We do, and that means we can choose differently. A Fish Out of Water, written by Helen Palmer, is a story about a small, ordinary creature whose world spins out of control because someone doesn't follow the rules. In a way, it's fitting, because the rules of how we remember people are broken. We remember the loudest name, the biggest brand, and the catchiest rhyme. We forget the woman who saw a man doodling in his notebook and said, "You should be doing that." We forget the partner who built an imprint, who edited the manuscripts, and who carried the weight when the world only knew his name. We forget the person behind the pen name. Tonight, we remember her, Helen Palmer Geisel, writer, editor, co-founder, and partner. A woman whose story deserves more than a single line in someone else's biography. Thank you for stepping behind the curtain with me. If you found value in this episode of A Veil of Crime, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might also want to know the story behind the stories. And if you're struggling, please reach out. Stay. I'm Rebecca, and this has been A Veil of Crime. Until next time, keep your eyes open, because even in the brightest worlds, there are shadows.